Activism in Progress series, which is organised by the LAGB Subcommittee for Race and Social Justice in Linguistics. So we're a subcommittee of the Linguistics Association of Great Britain. And we are extremely happy today to welcome Dr. Ruanni Tupas, who is an associate professor from the Institute of Education at UCL. And Dr. Tupas works in the sociolinguistics of education and has published quite widely on the politics and ideology of English and bilingualism and multilingualism and the inequality of different Englishes, and is the editor of a recent Routledge volume investigating unequal Englishes, which offers a critical perspective on world Englishes and the injustice experienced by speakers of these varieties. Today, he's going to be speaking about the inequalities of multilingualism in digital communities, and specifically in the context of pop music in the Philippines. And so with that, if you would like to share your slides and take the floor.
All right. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much, Laura, for the introduction and also for reaching out to me for this invitation. So thank you. Thank you very much. And hello, everyone, again. Hello, everyone, by the way, wherever you are from. Good day to you all. This is a topic that I'm actually always excited to share, because it's something that really flows naturally. I have been engaged. I mean, I have been working in the area of social linguistics and education, but every time I look at and locate the work within pop music and Filipino pop music, it's something that I'm always excited to share. So I hope I am able to translate that excitement to the presentation. But it's not in the slide. I just actually realized after I just a few minutes ago that this presentation is actually part of the chapter that is just recently published. So I'll just read here in the Oxford Handbook of Language and Prejudice. It's edited by Jane Setter, Sandra Dovchin, and Vijay Ramjatan. So I thought I should acknowledge this feedback presentation today. Let me then now share. Okay, so here it is, my slides. So this is a pretty much straightforward presentation, just simply a kind of sharing with everyone, the kinds of stuff that I do as a scholar, as a researcher, concerned with inequalities of multilingualism, and specifically inequalities of multilingualism in the Southeast Asian region, and of course, still more specifically in the Philippines. And so it's pretty much just sharing some of these initiatives that I've engaged in, and the kinds of challenges that I face along the way as well. So here I'm really going to just really like zoom into something very, very specific, and just what I said, something that I'm been very much excited about working on for quite a number of years now. Nevertheless, I would like to somehow spend a little bit, just a bit of time, just locating this particular presentation in a much larger historical trajectory, because I think it's important that when we're talking about linguistic prejudice, we're talking about inequalities of multilingualism and addressing them, that we need to have a very broad historical trajectory to see and trace, where such practices actually and ideologies go back to. And so it's the same thing here as far as the Philippines is concerned, when we're talking about inequalities of multilingualism, linguistic prejudice, and certain language ideologies. In other words, we're talking about all of these as rooted in colonial history. And something that is really very, very, I don't want to call it peculiar to the Philippines, but something that is really very, very prominent and pronounced in the politics of language in the Philippines is the whole idea of Philippine languages as often viewed as dialects, and therefore that's reinforcing inequalities. And when I say very particularly distinct or powerful in the context of the Philippines is because even in current discourses, popular discourses about language, um, and specifically about the Philippine languages, there is, this recurring conversation about whether Philippine languages are languages and dialects. And I have to say that in my decades of working with teachers and students and even parents about addressing multilingualism, issues of multilingualism in the country, that there is a huge majority of Filipinos who refuse to think of Philippine languages as languages, because that is what they have been taught. What we have learned along the way is that Philippine languages are just dialects. And so being able to um, pinpoint on pin down a particular linguistic issue, such as this one, will somehow to me made things a little bit clearer in terms of what it is that is very much embedded in a lot of our work and a lot of our discussion and our discourses about languages in the country. And so to be able to transform thinking about Philippine languages as languages and not as dialects um, will go a long way in promoting and embracing multilingualism in the country. And of course, I come in with how to address this in the context of social, no, spaces in social media as a way to somehow challenge these biases. So, what is the historical context from where emerge these um, you know specific ideologies about Philippine languages or about language in general? And I talk about these two related ones. Of course, we go back to the Philippine American War. Um, uh, Between 1899 to 1902, and the formal colonial government that ensued after that, which of course would be the American colonization through benevolent assimilation. Benevolent assimilation, of course, was a state-driven policy, a colonial government driven policy that was meant supposedly to assimilate Filipinos into the American way of life. But unlike the Philippine American War, which was of course physically brutal, the idea was to somehow lead us to assimilation through benevolent means. And throughout the whole history of colonization, of American colonization, benevolence here would mean the deployment and mobilization of education, especially education, as a way to assimilate Filipinos into American ways of thinking. And so through this benevolent assimilation policy, um, through which education was a hallmark of that policy, language definitely figured very prominently in the benevolent assimilation campaign of the United States. Now, so I will be, drawing from this, part of Philippine history to be able for us to understand more clearly where these specific online conversations have come from or have emerged. But just sampling quickly, just to give you even a much larger historical context, prior to the Philippine-American War, all right, the Philippines was also colonized by Spain, much longer for about 333 years, meaning more than 3 centuries. But more than education, it was really religion that was prominent during Spanish colonization. But when the Americans came, it was really education that was the hallmark of the colonizing tools. Um, in sometime towards the middle part of the 20th century was what we would refer to as the Commonwealth of the Philippines. This was still under direct rule of the United States, but Commonwealth of the Philippines would mean the initiatives, the formal initiatives to Philippinize the Philippine society and especially leadership. So all the departments of the government would then be replaced by Filipinos. But what was consistent throughout the whole history of American colonization in the Philippines was that the Department of Education was never under a Filipino Department secretary. It was always an American education secretary. And 1946, of course, was the formal Philippine independence uh, given to the United States, to the Philippines, and then I would then refer to 1946 onwards as what we might call post-colonial Philippines, 1946 to the present. So I thought I should give this as a kind of an overview for us to somehow understand the context within which I will be talking about, online work, current online work that I'm engaged in. But nevertheless, um, during the Philippine-American War, it was actually during that time that the Sherman Commission was established. This would be more popularly known as the First Philippine Commission, but basically this was the commission, a five-man commission, American all American members of the commission, basically tasked to supposedly gather information and knowledge about the Philippines, all right, and about the Filipinos. Um, this is not, of course, the time to talk about some of that, much of that information and knowledge. But I think what is relevant to us was that this was the commission that gathered information supposedly about the state of Philippine languages and language teaching and learning around the country. I but unfortunately, the gathering of information was through American soldiers who were stationed in different parts of the archipelago. So they were asked about, Philippine languages, the state of education from where they were, and of course, almost in unison, they would say that the so-called Philippine dialects were actually unnecessary and were actually the cause of disunity among Filipinos, and therefore there was a need for a common language, and of course this would be the English language. So even before the formal establishment of the American colonial government, a policy was already put in place to use English in and to teach English in all schools across the Philippines. So when we're talking, therefore, of the U.S. colonial legacy here, um, we're talking, of course, of the U.S. colonial period as having institutionalized English as the language of power. Now, if you see that, that capture of a title of a news article, sometime I think in the 1920s, if I'm not mistaken, or probably even earlier than that. Um, Yes, 1916, right? The title here, I think, really tells us a lot about the story of English in the country. It says here, English ousts dialects from the Philippines, and I think the word oust itself somehow gives us an idea of somehow it gives a feel of being violent. The removal was not something that just simply was done without resistance, and indeed there was a lot of resistance, but English, because it was part of the colonial infrastructure, was then imposed as the also sole language of instruction in the Philippines. But the ousting, of course, would be at the expense of the so-called Philippine dialects. So here, notice here, the dialects would then be would be used to refer to the Philippine languages, and this has been, you know, in the case and institutionalized in Philippine education to the point that Philippine languages were disregarded as languages, but definitely just simply be described as dialects. There were indexicalities that then started to be attached, so to speak, to the Philippine languages. Indexicalities of backwardness, being backward, being unmodern, for example, unnecessary, being from the province, not urban, and so on and so forth, which therefore, through the education system was perpetuated again and again and again, that until even now, some Philippine textbooks, and still the teaching would, work to would still establish, perpetuate this kind of an understanding of Philippine languages as dialects. So what are some of those examples of these inequalities of multilingualism currently, just to give you a feel of, the more current um, you know, uh, state of the politics of language in the country. Some time ago, there were 3 students who were expelled for speaking Ilocano. Ilocano is one of the 180 Philippine languages. It's spoken up in the in the north of the Philippines. It's actually the mother tongue of my wife, something that I cannot, that unfortunately I'm able to speak and understand and comprehend as well. But this is very much a remnant of the colonial practice of requiring students to speak only in English. And there would be repercussions if you would be caught speaking in your own vernacular languages. I grew up and also, were educated in contexts where we were also banned. The use of the mother tongues or the vernacular languages was banned, and we would be punished um, for speaking the vernacular as well. But this is a quite a recent one, the past decade, in event, or something that actually caught the imagination of the entire nation, because now it again drew up, a number of conversations about the importance of English as the language of globalization, and at the same time also supposedly the rights of Filipinos to their own languages as well. The more unfortunate, of course, um, recent development in the country was the discontinuation of the mother tongue as medium of instruction from kindergarten to grade 3. Um, the while throughout the American colonization and even after that, by and large, English was medium of instruction. In the 1970s, it became bilingual, both in English and Tagalog, which is the national language of the country, named Filipino. Sometime about 15 years ago, there was a movement to um, make the mother tongues, as the languages of instruction for basic education, for at least the early years of basic education. There was a whole lot of debate regarding this, but because of institutional support, probably at the time, the people who were at the Department of Education were actually linguists and also trained in educational linguistics. Somehow there was that kind of a push, and so on and so forth. But very recently, actually last year, um, this kind of an initiative, this kind of a policy um, was discontinued. In other words, it now becomes another policy in the country to go back to the use of English and Filipino in some subjects of the education system. And lastly, I think it's very recent, actually, even it's as recent as last month. It's the other side of the discontinuation of the mother tongue as media of instruction from kindergarten to grade 3, and which is now the return, supposedly, of institutionalized or institutional support for English only policies, where students would now again be required to speak only in English, even in contexts where it's supposedly, English is not really, the 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 expected language of communication. Um, this sparked a whole lot of debate during the time. That was only last month. Everybody, all institutions coming in, and so on and so forth. But I guess the point here is that these three basically should give us an idea of what it is like in the Philippines at the moment when it comes to the inequalities of multilingualism, and more generally when it comes to the politics of language in the country. And I would say that these experiences in current, um, experiences with linguistic injustices are very much, traceable to colonial practices and colonial education. And therefore, there is a need to, carve out spaces wherever you are, in language teacher education that I'm always involved in, almost always involved in. I always talk about, carve out spaces where you think you can make change, any change wherever you are, right? And therefore, because of the need, to really continue the conversation and continue to get people involved in talking about um, language policy and language and education as well. So by and large, therefore, we're talking here of the Philippine languages as devalued in education, media, and policy, and which of course then translate to social inequalities. Now, so thinking about how to combat these linguistic, examples of prejudice, for example, and especially biases against Philippine languages. Um, I my experience tells me that as a researcher, I think it's important to really translate what your work into something that is very much understandable and comprehensible to people outside the academe. So there is a need to really raise public awareness through social media, because so many of everybody is in social media, and therefore it is in a sense a very wide space for us to tackle these linguistic issues. Engaging in popular culture and online movements, and I guess the point here is that you're not alone in talking about these and in raising awareness of linguistic inequalities. But I think it's really still just a matter of, consolidating your knowledge and understanding of these different initiatives online. And of course, collaborating with musicians and artists as well. That would, art musicians and artists who are themselves also advocating similar, causes concerning linguistic multilingualism in the country. So I'll start. Therefore here, so I now zoom in more specifically to something more specific. If you read my abstract, I did have a link there. So hopefully some of you, if not all of you, have at least watched that particular video. It's one of the many videos that this particular group has produced. But one thing that is really particularly distinct about this you know, group is that they have an explicit advocacy of promoting multilingualism. They are themselves speakers of different Philippine languages, and that's something already a step forward, because Philippine languages, other than just the national language, are rarely heard in the national mainstream, and especially in national mainstream music industry. There is a what you call, there is a kind of a silencing of a music that is sung and produced in other Philippine languages, that FM stations and radio stations refuse for quite a long time to play them, because supposedly they have limited audiences. And so when Alamat came, it really was explicit enough in talking about and advocating the use of Philippine languages. And alongside these, of course, would be raising awareness of our colonial legacies, raising awareness about colorism or racism as well. There is one video that they actually put together that talks about that raises issue about racism through colorism in the country. Um, just a little bit of a background to this. I mean, the Observer and many other international magazines have actually caught up with Alamat on this particular advocacy. And here, if you're interested, there is one article about them by the Observer. Being interviewed, Alamat being interviewed, and talking about how it is important for Filipinos to hug themselves again, all right, and to reconnect themselves with our own culture, precisely because in national music, in national mainstream music in the country, you can barely hear other Philippine languages, and you can actually um, you know different cultural traditions and even instruments are rarely heard in these national platforms. So one of the initiatives, of course, was something that I was myself, that I myself did not expect to happen, um, because of my writings about pop culture and pop music specifically, about fandoms which somehow at some point did talk about issues of language. Um, the Prior to coming out in public, the group Alamat actually reached out to me and basically asked me if I could collaborate with them for a very simple um, content video about promoting Philippine languages and about promoting Philippine languages as languages and not dialects. And as you can see here, I think so far it has had more than 500,000 views, something that is of course quite special for an educational video, something that is supposed to be academic, in texture, but it has actually been passed around, sent to schools. Schools have been using them to teach their kids about, the Philippine languages and the nature of these languages and the questionable understandings that we all have about Philippine languages as dialects as well. So they reach out to me and they basically asked me, they've been reading about my work on multilingualism, and they thought that probably I should be interested, that there is one group that was supposed to be coming out at the time, which would now be referred to as the only multilingual group, P-pop group in the Philippines. So here, one thing that I did was really to collaborate with other advocates. There are, as a scholar and as a researcher, I think, with dealing with or engaging in inequalities of multilingualism, I do feel that I have very limited space, to in a sense, you know, bring forth, my own research, my own research out into the world. And so by opening myself up and collaborating with other advocates who are not academics, who are not in the academe, opened up more, that space for me to have to engage with my own research as well. But as what I said, I have really been, in a sense, writing very short pieces for magazines, in different magazines, international and national magazines as well. This one was actually in a UK based Filipino magazine, which is meant to be distributed for free among Filipinos in the UK. So here I wrote about Philippine languages as not dialects, the edutainment of multilingual P-pop group Alamat. And see, the idea of edutainment, of course, is to really talk about how education and entertainment can actually go together, all right, and how entertainment can act through entertainment one can actually also help engage other people on concerning certain educational issues as well. Now, what is interesting here is that because this was put up online, when things are put up online, no one you have no in a sense you have no uh, control over who reads it anymore, right? But it's surprisingly, well, not surprisingly, but then of course it went back to the fandoms of to the fandom of Alamat. And so again, this time, not the Alamat official, but the Alamat fans reached out to me and said, can we actually use your article, because we would like to produce a brochure for Alamat on Alamat, and you know distribute that brochure to fellow fans and other people who would be attending concerts and mall shows of the group as well. And so they came up with a brochure. As you can see, it's actually a foldable kind of brochure, all right, where they actually then reprinted my own article. And at the back of it, of course, would be information about Alamat, visuals and their costumes and stuff like that, and what they stand for. Now, um, but what is, of course, even far more interesting is that, then the fans started tagging me. All right. These are just sample pictures of photos of fans going around during mall shows, during concerts, then distributing the brochures to people who were around. And interestingly, not just simply sharing and distributing those brochures, but spending a little bit more time to explain um, what the advocacy of Alamatis is really all about. So here it's something that, as what I said, just really beyond my control. The fans to control, took ownership over it, and somehow use it as a kind of a takeoff point for them to actually introduce their own idols, right? Now, this one is another a particularly interesting photo. Remember, I don't have I did not take these photos. I was tagged online by these different fans, because here the story behind is that the fan actually previously had conversations about Philippine languages as languages or as dialects, all right? And because of his conversations with fans and this brochure, he took it upon himself to get to ask for a brochure and go back to school and share that brochure with the teacher, who he said he had a conversation with, the conversation about why Philippine languages are not dialects but are actually languages. So interestingly here, what I'm saying is that I think to me, when you do online work, especially for online advocacy work, I think you need to prepare for the unexpected. These are things that were not part of my old plan, really, but it turned out really quite fascinating to me, because now fans on their own, made use of whatever content they had from me, all right, and delivered it in the way that they think was um, helpful for them to even also introduce their own group. And lastly, the last thing here, of course, initiative would be to somehow mobilize free spaces online. So here I'm talking about you know spaces on X, the previously Twitter. I'm not sure whether all of you are familiar with the spaces on X. You just think of like something like this, um, like this kind of a platform or Zoom, but there are no, of course, there's no video, but I mean, there's only you talking to one another online, but it's something that is actually free, so you can actually put up an event on anything that might be interesting to a lot of people, and people can just simply go in and listen to you talk about this issue with others. So if you look at the first one here, what I put together was a talk about, well, Philippine languages as languages or dialects, or questions about why do we name our specific languages this and that, because in the Philippines there are still some conversations about why the different ways of naming our own languages as well. So I put this up and invited a couple of people to somehow be in conversation with with me, regarding this. Another one, that's one below that, is multilingualism and and crisis communication. Basically here about the role of multilingualism during emergencies and disasters. The idea that there has been empirical work in the Philippines that basically showed that there is a need to really get the communities involved in preparing themselves in for some disasters, like typhoons, for example. But sometimes the communication or the message did not really come quite naturally, precisely because it was delivered either in English or in Tagalog national language, which was then still incomprehensible to quite a number of Filipinos as well. So this is how it actually looks. Yeah. Um, So you see there, these are accounts who go into that space, right? Not This just as one page. I mean, there are so many others who um, also joined for each of the talks, so usually about 80 to 120. So that's me as the host, for example. Then it's me, somehow trying to organize the conversation. Um, and as you can see here, the official Alamat account is also there to support the conversation. So there is that kind of a really strong collaboration between us in terms of promoting these kinds of issues online. And I've gathered and brought together speakers from the different, areas of disciplines in the academe, social linguists, anthropologists, um, community development specialists, to talk about these issues, these language-focused issues as well. The rest, of course, would be fans of Alamat or those, public at large who are interested in the topic. They can just go in and, be part of the conversation as well. So what we see here really is that it's really a kind of forming of solidarities using accessible online platforms. This is, of course, a free, accessible online platform that, in a sense, delivers certain topics and conversations that otherwise would have been missed by people because they are not in the academe. So what I realized from here, to just put this all together, is that engaging in the public, directly engaging Filipinos on online discussion is really very important. I think there's, as what I said, I feel, and I've always felt that, just speaking, talking about my own research and in academic terms, I mean, it's very, very limited. And so to be able to really talk with others about inequalities of multilingualism, one really has to talk directly with them and to engage them. And so that's what I said, it came very naturally with me because I wasn't really coming in as a researcher. I wasn't really coming in as an academic. I was part of the fandoms of Alamat and other groups as well, engaging in their own conversations and then picking up from there language issues that I could probably then turn into something that will engage them more in these particular areas. And therefore, writing in accessible language for non-academic audiences is really very important because, again, it's something that allows them to realize that language issues such as inequalities of multilingualism are actually and
Now,
inequalities of
the
multilingualism
successes
are
that I talk
actually
about in
all right. Inequalities of multilingualism are things that they are also very much engaged in everyday life. I could somehow get people to read my own articles, academic articles on inequalities of multilingualism, but the feeling would be like it's something that is a detached kind of issue from their everyday realities. But in fact, they are themselves already engaged in these inequalities in everyday conversations online. And which makes then therefore these social linguistic issues relatable through pop culture. But there are challenges, of course. misinformation, and again here I'm referring specifically, at least for this particular talk, to misinformation about what constitutes Philippine what constitutes a language and a dialect. So in the video that I talk about not only the linguistic dimension to the difference between language and dialect, but also the political dimension to it. And I think it has to, we need to raise that kind of an awareness, because there are a lot of like misconceptions. When people actually say, actually it's a dialect because I googled it and Google said it's a dialect, so that's it. All right, because indeed, because of the algorithms and because of the dominance of this whole idea of Philippine languages as dialects, that so when they actually search online, much of the information that actually they get and receive is that Philippine languages are indeed dialects and not languages. There are, of course, also, there's strong resistance from institutions that uphold linguistic hierarchies. The spaces that I usually I held, and in on X, for example, are spaces that I send out, and I invite institutions and colleges and colleges of language and arts to somehow encourage their students to also attend. But that doesn't really usually become really very successful, because there is a kind of uh, you know a kind of resistance, in other words, to these kinds of conversations, like we don't know what you are going to talk about, and it may be harmful and may actually be dangerous to the students understanding of language or linguistics. And of course, the one challenge is, and the most important would be ensuring that online discussions lead to real world change. So that's where I think it's where the challenge really usually is, in that context. And in my case, of course, because in a sense, I must say I made myself available, not just made myself available, but made myself vulnerable online. There have actually been quite a number of invitations to continue getting on this conversation in their different institutions as well. Um, Now, this is my second to the last slide. This one is very recent, and I think and it somehow is a product of that whole conversation online that we have fielded, again and again for quite many years. But this one is something very special, because this is something that actually we hope would accommodate us, but we actually didn't see it coming, because it came from the Department of Education itself. NEAP is the National Educators Association of the Philippines, in charge of the professional development of all Filipino educators. And we have actually, and I have actually been, you know, for the past few years, been trying to, in a sense, open the conversations to this institution. But I guess, as what I said, it always got rejected, precisely because of this whole fear of supposedly engaging students and educators on issues that were supposed to be harmful and counterproductive. But I guess because of like is sufficient, and I must say multiple platforms talking about these issues online, we somehow saw it as a little bit victory when a colleague of mine from back in the Ateneo de Manila University and I were able to somehow open up the discussion to the educators at the Department of Education. That's, as you can see here, just very recently, around 134,445 of them actually earned CPTV units through us, through the masterclass that we delivered, through pop culture, through pop culture, and of course multilingualism and multilingual education. Now, one thing that is, of course, very that we are very optimistic about is that we have been asked to continue with this kind of collaboration. So there is more to come, and I think, to me, this is where I think what initially would have started as something like a fandom kind of an initiative to somehow get everyone to talk about certain language issues now spreads back to the school, spreads back to educational institutions, and hopefully more and more people and more educators will be tackling this issue as well. So in conclusion, as what I said, it's really very deeply rooted. I started with, tracing this back to colonial history, but can also be challenged. Social media tools can be harnessed to address problems of linguistic inequalities. And lastly, that direct engagement is really key. Not just simply getting them to read my own work, my own academic work, but really to enter communities, online communities, fandoms, to be able to, get more meaningful conversations out of it. So that's all for today, and I'm looking forward to some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting and really, kind of very unexpected in a way. I shouldn't have found it unexpected, but just to see the impact of getting a popular group on board, it's amazing. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask? I think I've set it so you can just unmute yourselves. If not, I can do it for you. And also the chat is open. Okay, Louise, are you able to unmute? If not, I'm actually also going to, so I don't know if anyone knows the answer to this because I was able to mute someone